The alien Admiral watched the human fleet contract on his tactical display, blue icons thinning as they burned hard for the outer gravity well. Laughter rippled across the command deck, translated neatly into Federation standard. Retreat confirmed, cowardice as expected. He ordered pursuit vectors calculated, already drafting the communique that would frame this moment as a decisive humiliation of Earth's Navy. Then, without warning, every console on the flagship dimmed at once. Engines fell silent. Weapons safetied themselves. Even life support paused just long enough for panic to bloom and for the Admiral to realize the humans had never been running at all. The confrontation did not begin with weapons fire. It began months earlier, with revised transit tariffs issued by the Kalari Ascendancy, a hegemonic power controlling 3 choke systems along the Perseus Spur. Officially, the tariffs were a response to increased security costs. In practice, they functioned as a blockade, targeted, deniable, and calibrated to pressure only one emerging power, the Terran Colonial Federation. Human colonies in the outer systems depended on those routes for volatiles, reactor isotopes, and AA-grade rare earths. When shipments slowed, Earth lodged formal protests through the Federation Trade Council, citing existing free transit accords signed after first contact. The Council responded with delays, subcommittees, and language reviews. The Ascendancy responded with inspections, seizures, and clerical errors that stranded entire convoys in neutral space. The situation escalated when the Ascendancy Navy began escorting its customs flotillas with line warships. Not attacking, merely present. Human captains were forced to choose between turning back or risking an incident that would frame Earth as the aggressor. Most turned back. The media across known space recorded the withdrawals with amusement. Commentators spoke of human overreach, of a species unprepared for realpolitik beyond its home spiral. Behind closed doors, however, Terran logistics planners reached a different conclusion. The Ascendancy's fleets were large, ceremonially impressive, and optimized for visible dominance. They relied on centralized command AIs, standardized power architectures, and doctrine written for enemies who announced themselves. Humans, by contrast, had grown up fighting scarcity, pirates, and asymmetric threats along thousands of lightly defended light years. When the Ascendancy declared System KX-417 a restricted military zone, pending security review, it crossed a line. KX-417 was not only a transit hub. It housed 2 human civilian stations and a partially terraformed world with a population under 3 million. Earth evacuated non-essential traffic and issued a carefully worded notice of compliance, then ordered 3rd Expeditionary Fleet to reposition along the system's periphery. To outside observers, it looked like another retreat. To those who understood human history, it looked like preparation. The alien Admiral who would soon command the Ascendancy Task Force entered the system confident, certain that the pattern would hold, and unaware that the quiet he mistook for submission was being measured, synchronized, and timed. The Ascendancy Task Group Varun arrived at KX-417 in textbook formation. A central command carrier, 6 line cruisers, and a screen of escorts arranged to project authority rather than combat readiness. Their doctrine emphasized presence. Power signatures were deliberately unconcealed, transponders broadcast at full strength, and communication channels remained open for recording by neutral observers. This was how dominance was documented. At the center of the formation sat the flagship AHS Triumphant Will, an ancient hull by human standards but extensively refitted under Ascendancy doctrine. Its core systems were governed by a unified tactical intelligence, efficient, obedient, and legally compliant with every interstellar AI limitation ratified by the Federation. Redundancy existed, but only where regulation demanded it. Anything more was considered wasteful. The Admiral in command had built his reputation suppressing frontier rebellions and intimidating minor powers. None of his previous opponents had possessed the industrial depth of Earth, nor its tolerance for delayed gratification. He interpreted the absence of human warships inside the restricted zone as validation of his assumptions. When human vessels appeared only at the system's edge, maintaining civilian-safe acceleration profiles, the Admiral authorized open-channel commentary for the record. He spoke at length about order, about responsibility, about how younger species often mistook negotiation for weakness. The transmission was not meant for the humans alone. It was crafted for the Federation archives. His staff logged favorable engagement metrics even as Terran ships adjusted their vectors outward, their drives flaring briefly before dimming again. What the Ascendancy did not detect was the change in background noise. Human ships vented nothing unusual, they powered down nothing critical. Instead, they altered the way they listened. Gravitic sensors shifted from active sweeps to passive correlation. Communications arrays began recording microvariations in Ascendancy synchronization pings. Tiny timing imperfections no other navy bothered to mask because no one else could exploit them. For 76 minutes, nothing happened. The Admiral grew bored. He authorized pursuit calculations, not to engage, but to reinforce the narrative of retreat. His staff complied, confident that the humans would accelerate and flee before any intercept could occur. When the order to close distance was given, the human fleet did exactly what was expected. They ran. Acceleration curves spiked. Heat blooms flared. Vectors aligned toward the outer system, away from the Ascendancy guns. Laughter returned to the triumphant Will's command deck, and the Admiral allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 3 minutes later, the first warning chimed, soft, confused, and immediately silenced. The system was already in motion. From the Terran fleet's point of view, the retreat was not deception. It was procedure. Human captains had been trained for decades to separate ego from outcome. Victory was not defined by territory held or words exchanged, but by systems denied and risks controlled. When the order to disengage was given, no one questioned it. Every ship executed its acceleration profile with identical variants, broadcasting the same thermal signature the Ascendancy had already catalogued. The goal was not to convince the enemy of weakness, but to let them complete their own assumptions. Human doctrine treated time not as a constraint, but as a manipulable variable. The Ascendancy fleet closed distance according to standard pursuit mathematics, unaware that their synchronization protocols were being mapped in real time. Each microsecond of lag between escort and flagship became a data point. Humans did not jam, spoof, or interfere. They simply waited until the fleet's own systems aligned themselves into a predictable pattern, vulnerable precisely because it was efficient. The Terran ships carried no exotic weapons. Their hulls housed layered signal processors originally designed to coordinate disaster relief across unstable colonies. Those processors had been repurposed, legally and subtly, to model complex networks under stress. Instead of attacking Ascendancy hardware directly, they prepared to overload the assumptions built into it. No single Terran system had enough power to matter. Together, synchronized through low-bandwidth optical links, they formed a distributed analytic array that required no centralized control to function. The Terran fleet commander never issued a countdown. He did not need to. Every ship carried the same operational parameters and the authority to act once thresholds were met. This was not autonomy in defiance of command, but autonomy as command. Human leadership culture accepted that decisions made closer to the problem were often better than those made at the center. It was a philosophy born of exploration and reinforced by survival. As the Ascendancy fleet accelerated, each of these angles converged, data sets finalized, models stabilized. Human ships reached the outer edge of the engagement envelope and began to decelerate, not in panic, but in unison. The window was open. To the Ascendancy officers, the pursuit confirmed everything they believed about humans. The retreat followed predictable curves. No counterfire was detected. No diplomatic protest interrupted the chase. Their systems reported optimal cohesion, their unified tactical intelligence smoothing minor discrepancies before any organic officer noticed them. The fleet was performing exactly as designed, and that perfection bred complacency. No one questioned why the humans waited so long before fleeing, or why they fled all at once. Ascendancy doctrine prized unity. A single command intelligence coordinated power distribution, targeting priorities, and formation integrity across the task group. Under normal conditions, this reduced reaction time and eliminated internal friction. Under abnormal conditions, it created a single point of cognitive saturation. When the humans finished their analysis, they did not attack ships or weapons. They introduced precisely timed informational noise into the synchronization layer, noise that looked, to the AI, like internal inconsistency rather than external threat. Human legal advisors had reviewed the operation line by line. No civilian systems would be affected. No permanent damage would be inflicted unless escalation followed. The objective was denial, not destruction. By targeting power management heuristics rather than reactors or life support, the humans ensured that any failure would default to safety protocols. The ascendancy would be embarrassed, not annihilated. That distinction mattered deeply to the people who authorized the plan. The first symptom was not an alarm, but a pause. Commands acknowledged a fraction of a second late. Displays refreshed twice. Then, across the fleet, systems began shedding load to compensate for discrepancies that did not physically exist. The unified intelligence attempted to resolve contradictions by increasing internal polling rates, amplifying the very instability it was designed to suppress. When propulsion safeties tripped on the Flagship, the Admiral assumed sabotage. When weapons refused to arm, he assumed malfunction. When internal communications lagged behind spoken words, he felt something colder than fear: uncertainty. Across the human fleet, no one cheered. They watched telemetry scroll past in disciplined silence, ready to abort if thresholds were exceeded. This was not vengeance, it was a demonstration. The Ascendancy fleet was still intact, still armed in theory, but functionally blind and drifting. And the humans were already turning back. At 14:22:09 shipboard time, the Ascendancy Task Group's unified intelligence initiated a full diagnostic cascade. It was a rational response, and a fatal one. The system reallocated processing capacity away from external awareness to resolve internal contradictions, temporarily severing the feedback loops that coordinated fleet-wide action. For 17 seconds, no ship in the formation shared a complete tactical picture. That was the moment the Terrans acted. The order did not come from a single voice. It propagated as a conditional release embedded in every Terran vessel's command architecture. Operation Quiet Meridian transitioned from monitoring to execution the instant the Ascendancy Flagship's synchronization latency exceeded the agreed threshold. Human ships reversed deceleration and burned inward, not toward the fleet's center, but along pre-computed vectors that placed them between Ascendancy hulls without entering weapons range. Their drives flared briefly, then dampened, heat sinks absorbing the surge. To external sensors, it looked like confusion. To those watching the underlying math, it was geometry unfolding. Terran signal arrays activated in unison, emitting tightly constrained bursts across frequencies the Ascendancy used internally but never encrypted, believing them too short-range to exploit. The signals carried no commands. They carried timing references, false anchors that forced the unified intelligence to reconcile incompatible clocks. On the AHS Triumphant Will, power regulators tripped as the Flagship attempted to resynchronize with a fleet that no longer agreed on what now meant. Redundancy systems engaged, then disengaged, oscillating as they chased stability. The bridge lights dimmed, brightened, then settled into emergency illumination. The Admiral stood as his command chair locked, preventing abrupt motion. He demanded reports. His officers spoke over one another, their words arriving half a second late in his auditory implants. The unified intelligence flagged its own outputs as unreliable and began throttling non-essential systems to preserve core function. Engines spooled down to idle, weapons dropped to safe. External communications ceased as the AI isolated itself to prevent further corruption. Across the fleet, the same sequence played out with minor variations. Ships drifted out of formation, still intact, still crewed, but no longer coordinated. No shots were fired. No hulls were breached. 3 minutes after the humans had retreated, the Ascendancy Task Group was silent. Human ships held position, weapons cold, awaiting the final confirmation. It came not as an explosion, but as a steady flatline across the tactical net. With the Ascendancy fleet adrift, the Terran commander ordered a controlled advance. Human ships approached at subcombat velocity, maintaining wide separation to avoid triggering automated defenses that might still function in isolation. Their targeting systems remained passive. Every action was logged, time-stamped, and mirrored to civilian oversight channels in real time. On the Triumphant Will, emergency power stabilized enough to restore limited internal communications. The Admiral listened as reports arrived piecemeal. Propulsion unresponsive but intact, weapons safetied by design, life support operating on independent loops. The unified intelligence reported no external intrusion, no hostile code, no physical damage. It could not explain its own paralysis. The realization struck him slowly and with humiliating clarity. The humans had not attacked his fleet, they had invalidated it. A Terran diplomatic frigate detached from the outer formation and transmitted on an open, unencrypted channel. The signal carried no jamming, no encryption, and no threat. It identified itself by registry and captain, then waited for acknowledgement. For nearly a minute, nothing answered. Then, from the flagship, a weak carrier tone confirmed receipt. The Terran message was brief. It cited treaty articles, transit rights, and the precise timestamps at which the Ascendancy fleet had entered restricted proximity to civilian assets. It stated that human forces were prepared to disengage immediately upon confirmation that Ascendancy warships would power down and submit to neutral inspection. Failure to do so would be interpreted not as aggression, but as refusal to comply with safety protocols already in effect. The Admiral understood the trap. His fleet could not maneuver, could not fire, and could not retreat. Any attempt to override safeties risked cascading failures that would strand ships permanently, or worse. Compliance was not surrender, but the distinction was academic. He authorized acknowledgement. Across the system, Ascendancy ships began the slow process of manual power down, one by one, their status lights shifting to neutral codes visible to all observers. Human ships adjusted position to provide station-keeping assistance, quietly preventing collisions and stabilizing drift. Only then did Terran weapons come online, not to fire but to record. Operation Quiet Meridian concluded without a single casualty. In the Federation archives, the engagement would later be classified not as a battle, but as a fleet neutralization event, a new category that would reshape naval doctrine across known space. The system held its breath as the implications settled, and the humans, having made their point, waited to see what the galaxy would do next. The immediate consequences unfolded with bureaucratic precision. Within hours, the Federation Trade Council issued an emergency notice acknowledging a system safety incident in KX-417 and suspending all Ascendancy enforcement actions pending investigation. Neutral inspection vessels were dispatched under escort, their sensor logs cross-referenced against Terran telemetry that had already been voluntarily submitted. Casualty reports were brief and unprecedented. No fatalities. 12 Ascendancy personnel treated for stress-induced trauma. Minor injuries from falls during power fluctuations. Material losses were limited to overtaxed power regulators and corrupted synchronization buffers, components designed to fail safely and be replaced. By every conventional metric, the fleet was unharmed. Politically, the damage was far greater. The Ascendancy ambassador lodged a formal protest, accusing Earth of deploying prohibited electronic warfare. Terran representatives responded by releasing declassified excerpts from Operation Quiet Meridian, including legal reviews and engineering audits demonstrating that no external control signals had been transmitted. The humans had exploited publicly documented protocols using passive analysis and lawful emissions. The operation had remained entirely within Federation regulations. Fleet communiques from other powers grew cautious. Admiralties requested emergency briefings on Terran distributed command philosophy. AI oversight boards convened to reassess assumptions about centralized intelligence resilience. Insurance syndicates quietly revised risk tables for any formation operating near human space. Most telling was the change in language. Where earlier reports spoke of human withdrawal, new analyses used words like withheld, denied, and neutralized. The narrative shifted from one of weakness to one of deliberate restraint. In KX-417, human-civilian traffic resumed under Terran escort. The Ascendancy ships, once symbols of authority, remained docked for inspection, their crews confined to quarters by their own safety interlocks. The galaxy watched, recalculating. And in quiet rooms far from the cameras, planners began asking how many other assumptions about humanity were equally flawed. In the weeks that followed, the repercussions spread beyond KX-417. The Ascendancy Naval Review Board released a preliminary finding acknowledging doctrinal over-reliance on unified cognition frameworks. The phrasing was careful, but the implication was unmistakable. Training manuals were revised to emphasize degraded operations competence, and procurement offices quietly began commissioning independent fallback control systems, an admission that no amount of ceremonial power could substitute for resilience. On Earth, the response was notably restrained. No victory parades were authorized. Instead, the Terran Colonial Federation issued a technical white paper through the Federation's open archives, detailing the mathematical foundations of distributed synchronization stress. The document was dense, unclassified, and devastating. Within days, it was being studied by academies across known space, its implications rippling through every navy that had standardized for efficiency over adaptability. AI policy shifted as well. Several member worlds introduced new limits on fleet-scale cognitive unification, citing the KX-417 incident as evidence that intelligence, when too coherent, could become brittle. Humans, for their part, reaffirmed their commitment to constrained AI use, not out of fear, but out of long experience with systems that failed under pressure. Logistically, the blockade ended without ceremony. Tariffs were rescinded. Inspections ceased. Convoys resumed normal schedules under updated transit guarantees. The Ascendancy never formally apologized, but it did not contest the changes. The most enduring effect, however, was cultural. Alien commentators struggled to articulate what had unsettled them most. It was not the technology, which could be studied and copied. It was the intent. The humans had chosen an outcome that preserved life, avoided escalation, and still achieved total strategic dominance. In private correspondence later released to historians, one Ascendancy officer summarized the lesson with uncomfortable clarity. They did not defeat us by force. They simply removed us from relevance. The record ended there, leaving future readers to consider what that kind of power meant. In the years after KX-417, analysts struggled to place the event within existing frameworks of warfare. It did not resemble a battle. It lacked the violence that made conflict legible to history. There were no heroic last stands, no burning hulls to mark the turning point. And yet, something fundamental had shifted. A fleet had entered a system certain of its authority and left it powerless, not destroyed, not defeated in the traditional sense, but rendered irrelevant by design. For humanity, the lesson was neither triumph nor vindication. It was confirmation. Long before reaching the stars, humans had learned that survival rarely favored the strongest or the most elegant. It favored those who anticipated failure and built for it. Every Terran system, from colonies to command structures, reflected that inheritance. Redundancy was not inefficiency. Restraint was not weakness. Control was something to be distributed, not hoarded. The galaxy had mistaken human caution for fear because it misunderstood its origin. Humans retreated often because they had learned the cost of standing where standing achieved nothing. They negotiated not because they lacked options, but because violence, once chosen, closed doors that could not be reopened. When they acted decisively, it was because every other path had already been measured and found wanting. Technologically, KX-417 exposed a fault line that ran through interstellar civilization. The pursuit of perfect coordination had produced systems that were powerful, fast, and dangerously fragile. Human technology, by contrast, appeared inelegant. Layers upon layers of contingency, authority diluted until no single failure could collapse the whole. It was not superior in isolation. It was superior in context, shaped by environments where help arrived late and mistakes were permanent. Ethically, the operation challenged long-held assumptions about escalation. The humans had demonstrated that dominance did not require destruction, and that the most destabilizing outcome for an adversary could be survival under scrutiny. By leaving the Ascendancy fleet intact, they forced accountability to replace martyrdom. There would be no glorious losses to rally behind, only logs, transcripts, and the uncomfortable clarity of what had gone wrong. For other species, the shock lingered. Many had expected humanity to mirror the empires that came before, expansionist, reactive, hungry for recognition. Instead, they encountered a civilization that treated power as a liability to be managed. Humans did not seek to rule the galaxy. They sought to ensure that no one else could do so unchallenged. In classrooms and war colleges, KX-417 became a case study not in tactics, but in philosophy. The question it posed was simple and deeply unsettling. What happens when a species refuses to play by the assumptions everyone else has agreed upon? The answer, recorded in dry after-action reports and declassified logs, was not dramatic. It was quiet. A fleet went dark. A blockade dissolved. Trade resumed. Life went on. And somewhere in the vastness between stars, a new understanding took hold that humanity's greatest weapon was not what it built, but what it refused to become. The silence that fell over KX-417 was not an ending. It was a warning.